Breaking tonight, thousands of Americans are quietly heading north, reshaping migration patterns across North America. The data tells a story no one expected.
Analysts say it's not panic, it's planning. This shift could redefine North America's future.
Breaking tonight. A migration wave nobody saw coming just reshaped North American demographics. Americans didn't protest. They didn't march. They left. Tension is building across the border tonight. The United States went through a post-election crisis, but civil unrest never materialized. Instead, something quieter happened, something that might prove far more devastating in the long run. Educated professionals started packing their lives into boxes. Middle-class families began researching. Stable, employed Americans, the backbone of the economy, quietly opened Canadian immigration websites at 2 a.m. and started calculating points. Everyone believed America's middle class would adapt to economic pressure. Immigration experts expected temporary interest spikes that would disappear by spring. Policy analysts assumed the noise would fade within weeks, dismissed as emotional overreaction. Wall Street expected business as usual. They were all catastrophically wrong. Because what happened next wasn't panic, it was planning. And planning is far more permanent than protest. Early 2025, shortly after the US election, search engines registered something extraordinary. How to move to Canada queries didn't just increase, they exploded by over 200%. Picture this: midnight in suburban Chicago. A software engineer with 2 kids opens her laptop, not to scroll social media, to calculate express entry points. 3 a.m. in Austin, Texas. A healthcare administrator, stable job, good insurance, searches Canadian work permits. This happened simultaneously across thousands of American households. No press conference announced it, no politician acknowledged it. But the data revealed what thousands were thinking. Maybe North is better. And if you're someone who understands that the most important shifts happen quietly, before the headlines catch up, you'll want to stay with this channel. Because at Canada Next, we track the decisions people make before they become movements. This isn't about boats or fences. This is about resignation letters, sold houses, one-way flights to Vancouver. And what happened next reveals exactly why some Americans, stable and employed, are reimagining their entire lives across the border. Dear viewers, between January and March 2025, something unprecedented happened in cross-border migration patterns. Economic pressure mounted, healthcare costs spiraled, and Canada, structured and patient Canada, became the destination every frustrated American started researching first. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're witnessing. Canada's immigration, refugees, and citizenship plan projects, 395,000 new permanent residents in 2025. That number drops to 380,000 in 2026, then 365,000 in 2027. These aren't emergency refugees. Over 40% are people already in Canada as students or workers. By 2027, 62% will be economic class admissions, skilled workers, professionals, people who did the math. But here's what makes this moment so revealing. Statistics Canada shows U.S. citizen migration actually decreased by 20% during the previous administration compared to Trump's first term. The pattern is almost surgical. Americans consider leaving when certain leadership emerges. Not in masses, not dramatically, but consistently. After the 2024 election, Google searches about Canadian immigration spiked 200%. That's not migration yet. That's recalibration. That's thousands of Americans simultaneously asking themselves the same question: do we stay? And then the asylum numbers arrived, and this is where the story gets genuinely unsettling. More Americans applied for refugee status in Canada during the first half of 2025 than in all of 2024. Let that sink in for a moment. Americans seeking refuge, the total, around 245 applications out of 55,000 claims. Statistically tiny, symbolically massive. Because Americans don't typically cross borders seeking refuge. They're supposed to be the destination, not the departure point. They're supposed to be the place people flee to, not from. These aren't economic migrants from developing nations. These are U.S. citizens with passports, with education, with options, formally declaring to Canadian immigration authorities that they need protection. If you're watching this and thinking, this changes how I see American stability, you're not alone. And you're exactly the kind of viewer we create content for at Canada Next. Hit subscribe if you want analysis that sees patterns before they become headlines. Translation: something fundamental shifted in American perception of stability. Something cracked in the national psychology, and Canada's transparent, rule-driven immigration system became the answer people were searching for. So what's actually pushing Americans out? In my analysis, it's not catastrophe, it's erosion. It's not catastrophe, it's erosion. Economic pressure that grinds you down slowly, never quite letting go of your throat. Even middle-class Americans with solid incomes talk about feeling squeezed in ways the statistics don't really capture. Start with housing. Median new home prices in the U.S. hit roughly $430,000 in March 2025. That's down 7.5% year on year, which sounds positive until you realize incomes haven't grown in tandem. JP Morgan predicts home price growth will stay around 3% or less in 2025, but that still leaves property ownership absurdly out of reach for millions. The ladder isn't just steep anymore. For many, it's disappeared entirely. Then healthcare arrives like a recurring nightmare. Kaiser Family Foundation polling found nearly half of U.S. adults say affording healthcare is difficult. 1 in 4 report family members struggling to pay medical bills within the past year. Here's the devastating detail. 11% of U.S. adults are now classified as cost-desperate. They've recently been unable to afford needed care or medicine. Read that again. Cost-desperate. That's the clinical term researchers use for people who had to choose between medication and rent, between a doctor's visit and groceries, between treating their child's infection and paying the electricity bill. These aren't uninsured people gambling without coverage. Many have insurance. They pay premiums every month. They followed the rules, got employer coverage, thought they were protected. Having insurance no longer guarantees peace of mind. It just means you might survive the bill. Maybe. Picture a 42-year-old accountant in Phoenix. Good job. Health insurance through her employer. Her son breaks his arm skateboarding. After insurance, she still owes $3,800 for a broken arm. She has to choose between her 401k and her son's cast. That's not healthcare, that's extraction. And if that scenario sounds uncomfortably familiar to you, you're not imagining it. This is the reality millions navigate daily. Stay with Canada Next, because we document exactly how different systems produce different outcomes. Job growth projections compound the anxiety. Real GDP growth for the U.S. is forecast at only 1.7% in 2025, dropping to 1.4% in 2026. The U.S. added an average of just 74,000 jobs monthly in 2025, compared to 168,000 monthly in 2024. That's not crisis territory, that's plateau territory, especially brutal for mid-skilled workers whose wages aren't climbing while their costs are. According to the Federal Reserve Board's 2023 survey, 31% of adults said they were worse off financially than a year earlier. Nearly 1 in 3 people. Many more reported staying the same. The message? Stability is eroding even if outright collapse hasn't arrived yet, but underneath the numbers lives something darker. Fatigue. The bone-deep sense that life shouldn't be this hard, this brittle, this transactional. It's not the house is burning panic. It's the house costs more, the job shifted, the bill arrived, exhaustion. When that becomes normal, reassessing your location stops feeling radical. It starts feeling rational. So why Canada specifically? There's the obvious answer. Shared language, similar legal systems, cultural affinity. But the deeper draw is philosophical. Canada offers a version of life that seems just marginally more livable. Not easier necessarily, more balanced. There's a running joke that's not actually funny. If Walter White from Breaking Bad was Canadian, the show wouldn't exist. He wouldn't need to cook methamphetamine to pay for cancer treatment. That's not comedy. That's system design. Think about that for a second. An entire 5-season television drama, one of the most celebrated shows ever made in America, only exists because of healthcare bankruptcy. The whole plot, every death, every tragedy, centers on a chemistry teacher who can't afford his cancer treatment. Canadians watch that show confused. Why doesn't he just get treated? Americans watch it and nod grimly. Yeah, that tracks. That difference, that fundamental divergence in what people expect from their society, drives migration more powerfully than any politician's speech ever could. And if you're someone who's ever looked at healthcare bills and thought, this can't be normal, you're watching the right channel. Canada Next exists to show you what different systems produce. Canada's express entry immigration system operates on transparent, point-based criteria. The government publishes requirements. If you're educated, speak English or French, have work experience, you stand a reasonable chance. In 2025 alone, around 45,000 invitations to apply were issued through express entry by mid-year. The paths may not be easy, but they're visible and documented. For people who feel like they're rolling dice back home, that predictability matters enormously. But immigration processes are only part of the equation. It's the social contract itself that draws people. Universal health care, parental leave, stronger labor protections. These aren't extras in Canada. They're foundational. Consider parental leave specifics. Canada provides 15 weeks of maternity leave plus up to 35 weeks of standard parental leave. Oh wow. Or up to 61 weeks extended under the Employment Insurance Program. Benefits cover 55% of average weekly insurable earnings up to a maximum limit. By contrast, paid parental leave at the federal level in the U.S. is virtually non-existent. Most parents rely on unpaid leave if they're even eligible. Canada's system isn't perfect. Eligibility issues exist. Coverage gaps remain. But it offers a baseline of structural support that's visible and dependable. Canada frames itself as a society trying to hold things together rather than a perpetual showdown among factions. It's not immune to polarization, obviously, but the tone feels quieter, less gladiatorial. From outside, that matters tremendously. The feeling that public life isn't a constant high-stakes battlefield carries weight. I don't believe people are moving to Canada expecting utopia. They're moving with cautious hope. The hope that life might be slightly more manageable, slightly more humane. That's not revolution, that's recalibration. But migration at this scale creates ripple effects on both sides. Canada gains talent. Skilled immigrants boost sectors with labor shortages. They pay taxes, they settle. Often they stay. But strains exist too. Housing markets in Toronto and Vancouver are already expensive beyond reason. Public services, especially healthcare, are dealing with capacity issues. Immigration doesn't cause these pressures exactly, but it intersects with them in ways that matter. For newcomers, the adjustment isn't always smooth either. The weather can shock systems. Cultural differences, though subtle, can disorient. And certain systems like healthcare, while more equitable in design, can be slow or bureaucratic in practice. Meanwhile, the U.S. faces a different kind of loss of faith. When educated, employed people quietly leave, they don't just take skills. They take belief that the system can be repaired. Over time, that has cumulative psychological effects. It sends a message to those remaining. You don't have to stay. There is another way. We may also see new political influence from this migration. As diaspora communities form, they shape bilateral conversations. They vote. They advocate. They compare. Sometimes they push for policy changes back home, armed with examples from somewhere else. So where would you go if you had to leave? Would it be for safety or dignity? For opportunity or rest? This isn't hypothetical for thousands of Americans anymore. It's Tuesday morning planning. The Americans leaving now aren't defectors. They're not revolutionaries. They're just people who believe the system would work for them if they followed the rules. And now they're starting to doubt that. They're software engineers and nurses and teachers and accountants. People who worked hard, saved what they could, played by every rule they were given, and still ended up doing math at the kitchen table about whether they can afford their daughter's insulin. Canada to them isn't perfect. It's just slightly more boring, slightly more stable, slightly more kind. And in an era of ambient crisis, permanent low-grade crisis, those qualities carry enormous weight. What's most telling is these aren't desperate or displaced people. They're often the competent ones, the stable. People with just enough agency to leave, not because they're pushed to the brink, but because they sense the brink is approaching. That's not panic migration. That's strategic evacuation. And strategy is always more dangerous to a stability than chaos. This isn't judgment on America or celebration of Canada. It's a reminder that national character isn't destiny. It's design, culture, care, trust. And when those elements erode, people notice. They don't riot. They research. They calculate. They leave. If you've watched this far, you're exactly the kind of informed viewer Canada Next creates content for. People who get that the biggest shifts don't happen in press conferences. They happen in spreadsheets and search engines long before the headlines catch up. Subscribe now because we're tracking decisions that will reshape North America while everyone else is still reading yesterday's news. Thank you for watching. Be safe, be thoughtful, and keep your eyes open.